This screencast covers the pancreas and type 1 diabetes. First of all, we want to understand how the body regulates blood glucose concentration. We want you to understand what is type 1 diabetes, what is automated insulin delivery, and we want you to be able to develop a closed-loop block diagram for automated insulin delivery. This diagram illustrates how a healthy pancreas functions. You notice there's two different organs shown, the pancreas and the liver. And there's a number of different hormones and signals shown on this diagram. So let's step through this slowly and think about what the body does when faced with high blood sugar or high blood glucose. In that case, what happens is the pancreas, through the action of the beta cells in the pancreas, begins to secrete insulin. And what that insulin does is it stimulates glucose uptake from the blood into the tissue cells to grow tissue cells, and that acts to lower blood glucose. It also, the insulin acts in the liver to convert glucose into glycogen, which is a storage molecule, and that also acts to lower the blood glucose levels. So insulin is the hormone that causes glucose concentration to be brought down in the bloodstream. Now, on the other hand, if you have a low blood sugar or a low blood glucose situation, then the pancreas has the alpha cells that are stimulated to produce glucagon. And when that glucagon is produced, it acts in the liver and it converts the glycogen back into glucose, therefore raising the blood glucose, blood sugar levels. So the alpha cells act to produce glucagon, which increases glucose concentration. Now, somebody with type 1 diabetes eventually loses the ability to secrete insulin or substantial amounts of glucagon, and therefore they cannot regulate their blood glucose levels. Both the beta cells lose action and the alpha cells lose action, so you no longer have the ability to produce insulin. And what that really causes is, it's a long-term effect, because when you lose the insulin production, it leads to hyperglycemia, high blood glucose, long-term complications, retina diseases and such, and eventually leads to death if one does not take insulin. So therefore, an individual with type 1 diabetes must take insulin subcutaneously. Now, traditionally, starting in the 1980s, we had blood glucose meters. Before that, an individual would actually have to measure their urine glucose. But starting in the 1980s, they could have a blood glucose meter and typically would test, say, 5 or 6 times per day. And that's what I'm showing on this top plot. You'll notice that a lot of these dots represent glucose tests that are taken through these finger stick measurements. And they're actually outside the desired range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter, which we'd like to have the blood glucose concentration. So an individual is making infrequent measurements of their blood glucose levels. Similarly, what they're doing with insulin is they're typically injecting a long-acting insulin once a day, typically in the morning time, and that acts as more of kind of a steady state management of insulin concentration. Then with respect to each meal, they estimate the carbohydrates in the meal and inject a rapid acting insulin to compensate for those carbohydrates in the meal. And that's what's being shown each day here is one long acting insulin injection followed by 3 or 4 insulin injections to compensate for meals or snacks. With current technology, we've improved on both aspects. That is, we have continuous glucose sensors that measure the interstitial fluid just underneath the skin glucose levels, which are related to blood glucose. So on the left-hand side, you can see a continuous display. Basically, every 5 minutes, a new signal appears on the screen. So an individual can look at this monitor, a small receiver, and see what their blood glucose levels are. Then in terms of the right-hand side, I'm showing a continuous insulin infusion pump, which is continuously delivering rapid-acting insulin through this infusion set shown above. Now, since one has to program that pump ahead of time and then make changes, an individual is really, in a sense, serving as their own closed-loop controller. This is really known as sensor-augmented pump therapy, SAP. We think of it as open-loop control in the sense that you don't change the insulin delivery rates unless an individual makes the decision to do that. And typically then they would look at their blood glucose levels, they would think about the meal that they're going to consume, then they would make changes to the insulin pump to change the delivery rates, either providing a bolus, rapid acting amount of insulin to compensate for the meal, or making changes that have more long-term changes in the blood glucose level. But you can see the individual is acting as a closed-loop controller. What I'm showing on this screen is an automated closed-loop system where the signal is being sent from the sensor to a smart device, which has a control algorithm embedded on it. It might be PID, which we've typically learned in these control courses. It can be more complex control algorithms. But the output then is a signal to the insulin infusion pump to change the insulin delivery rate. And when you change the insulin delivery rate, that ends up impacting the individual's blood glucose levels, which ends up being reflected in this sensor. So you can see I'm really showing a feedback block diagram, but now what I'd like you to do over the next few minutes is draw your own control block diagram to represent this proposed closed loop system. You're going to have several components. So you're going to place a controller block, which input signals are going to include the continuous sensor reading as well as the desired glucose set point. And the output of that controller block is going to be the signal to the insulin pump. Similarly, you'll have a block representing the insulin pump taking the signal from the controller, and the output is the actual insulin being delivered to the individual. Then you'll have the individual patient block, which is taking insulin as well as meals. It could even include exercise as something that affects blood glucose. Then the output of the individual is the actual blood glucose value. Then finally, you'll have the sensor block, which is sensing blood glucose. It's turning that into a signal that's sent to the controller to form a fully closed loop block diagram. And what I want you to do now is pause this screencast and develop your own block diagram before I go through that. So here's the way I started out the block diagram. I started out with the insulin pump, which has the output of the insulin infusion rate to the individual. The individual then has insulin being delivered as well as possible meals or even exercise, and all those are going to affect the output, which is the blood glucose concentration. The sensor takes that as its input signal and then outputs a measured glucose signal, which is then sent to the controller. So you can see this is a feedback controller. It's taking the measured glucose, comparing it with the desired glucose set point, and the output is the insulin to the insulin pump. Now we can also add feed-forward control by having the individual estimate the carbohydrates in their meal, and that feed-forward information will cause an additional insulin delivery to compensate for the meal. So this is a fully closed-loop feedback feed-forward block diagram for automated insulin delivery, or you often see this called closed-loop artificial pancreas. So what we've done is we've learned that the pancreas regulates blood glucose through the secretion of hormones of insulin and glucagon. Somebody with type 1 diabetes can no longer produce their own insulin, so they require external insulin to be delivered. We developed an automated insulin delivery device which uses a continuous glucose monitor or sensor, an insulin pump, and a control algorithm on a smart device. And then finally, we developed a closed loop block diagram for automated insulin delivery.